But today, for me, I was called to speak to all of you. So I want to begin with you speaking and listening, as we heard by Ishma, Moshe, that Moses heard Yitro, right? We could take advice and wisdom from those who at least expect it. So if you are around children or the child at heart, whatever it is, I want you to ask a question to yourselves and then share it with the person next to you. Did you feel connected to the Jews in Congregation Beth Israel? I'm talking about the hostage situation in Texas, Colleyville, Texas. And why or why not? Let's just take a moment, 30 seconds. So I wanted to share what one of our children asked, his answer when I asked them. I said, why are you connected? How? He said, well, aren't we all related? I said, how so? He said, our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. So we're all like connected. And that's why I feel close to them. And that's why I feel it affected me. And I asked this question, by the way, I almost cried when he said those words. I asked this question because there's something that I think I've taken for granted for a long time, and I don't think I shouldn't. There's a well-known line in the Talmud that many of you may have heard before, Kol Yisrael Arivim Ze Bazeh, every Jew is responsible for one another. It was an ethos that I was raised with, and I've taught and spoken about it, but honestly, maybe I haven't taught about it enough. Because I think it comes down to a difficult question that Jews have. What are we? Are we a religion? Are we a race? Are we an ethnicity? Are we a people? What exactly are we, and what connects us? My Torah, the Torah that I hold dear to me, is a Torah that can be best summed up with the following statement. This is from Rabbi Hillel in Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of Our Fathers. He said, "Imein ani li mi li, ukshe'ani la'atzmi ma'ani, v'im lo achshav imatai." Rabbi Hillel used to say, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? My Torah is this mix of particularism, what we'd say of tribal connection of our people, ancestry, family, but also universalism, being out there in the outside world. The way I look at this is we don't act as Jews if we don't be Jews. Who's going to be Jewish? Who will be? But if we don't look out for our fellow Jews, then who will? And if we only look out for our fellow Jews, though, then what impact are we making on the greater world? And what is our view of those who aren't part of our people? And therefore, what am I waiting for? If not now, when? If I want to live in a perfect world, well, I better get to work trying to perfect it. That's the way I believe. That's my Torah. And it's fitting that we have a bat mitzvah today because we pass on the Torah to the next generation. That's what a b'nai mitzvah is. One of the things I realized was that I took this Torah, my Torah, for granted because it's not everyone's Torah. The reaction of some Jews based on faulty information last week was, why should we care about this rabbi when he's an anti-Zionist? By the way, the accusation was fabricated by a conservative talk show host without any evidence, and it turns out that it was completely false. Or they're Reformed Jews, which is an offensive term, so who cares? And on the other side, there were Jews who said, I'm here and they're there in Texas. And so, yeah, it's sad, but they're just like any other American. So it doesn't really affect me more than it affects anyone else. Now, there's so many aspects of this tragedy that I could speak about, but I want to focus on one thing, which is how are we connected as Jews to each other? And how should we act as Jews following each other after each successive anti-Semitic incident? And I think our parsha gives us great insight into this. Let's take a step back. Let's think about where our ancestors were at the point of receiving the Torah and how they were connected. We know that there is a connection that they felt to their tribes, that they had some sort of distant memory of an ancestor that may have been told by their parents, but mostly they were connected by oppression. They were slaves. They were connected by suffering. Beginning in Egypt, God creates opportunities little by little to unite them as a people, but really to form them as a people. The first mitzvah in the Torah, specifically for the Jewish people, is the creation of the Jewish calendar, shared sacred time. That was the first step. They were redeemed together as a people, so they shared that connection. But it wasn't enough. In this parasha, this week's parasha, God does the ultimate connection thing, the ultimate connection act, a covenant, an agreement between a people. The Midrash looks at Sinai not just as a time we received the laws, but it was also a marriage into itself. The Torah is our ketubah. Sinai was the chuppah that God held over our heads, and we as a people, men, women, children, all Jews of all time stood underneath that chuppah. We bound ourselves to each other in that moment. There's a very interesting line at this moment in chapter 19, verse 2. It says, having journeyed from Rephidim, they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Hahar. Israel encamped there in front of the mountain. But the grammar of this line is confusing because it starts off by saying they journeyed, they, and then it says Vayichan Sham. That only seemingly one person was camped there, but it says our people. So what does this mean? Rashi, quoting the Midrash, Rashi, the well-known medieval commentator, writes, Vayichan Sham Yisrael, and there Israel encamped, and he wrote these words, Ke'ish echad belev echad, as one person with one heart. And I think we have to look at this powerful teaching in an even broader way. They were like one person, but as we know, people cannot live forever. But I thought about this idea of the heart, because the heart can, in a sense. Sinai wasn't just in the past. There's a famous teaching that the souls of all Jews, as I mentioned before, were all there, past, present, and future. Whether you're born Jews, whether you converted to Judaism, you were at Sinai. All of you were at Sinai. We're all connected by that beating heart of that day. But perhaps I took that beating heart for granted. I thought that it would keep beating as long as there are Jews alive. But that's not the case. The heart needs blood pumping into it. It needs oxygen. That's why we need the Torah at our center. Now, the Torah isn't just that scroll in the Ark, and it's not just those books over there on that shelf. The Torah lives when we perform the mitzvot, the sacred acts that tie us to God, when we visit the sick, when we feed the hungry, when we welcome in guests, when we pray together, when we learn together. The Torah is not just a book. It is water. It is oxygen. It gives us life. It is called the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. And our tradition believes in the concept that there are 70 faces to Torah, that for each line of Torah, there are 70, if not more, interpretations, because Torah must be seen through your eyes and acted out with your hands, wherever you are, whatever place you live, whatever time you live. Now, you might wonder, why am I not speaking about anti-Semitism? And I'll say it, I'm going to be honest. I'm sick and tired of it. Fighting anti-Semitism should not be the obligation of the Jewish people. It should be the obligation of the non-Jewish world. In the face of hatred, when people say to us, you know what, if you want to be safe, maybe don't wear that kippah. You should be less Jewish. And then when you do that, they say, well, you're not really being honest with us. Maybe you should put that kippah back on. It's like no matter what we do, year after year, century after century, we face the same issues, no matter how much we change. So for me, I'm not taking my kippah off. I'm going to wear it proudly, just as Rabbi Charlie had said famously now this week. Rabbi Citron Walker wearing that kippah, he said, I'm going to continue wearing it, he said. And I'm going to continue to cling to the teachings of our ancestors so that one day we too can become ancestors and they too can have their own Torah. My message is, don't let these incidences take you away from Torah, to take you away from each other, to take you away from our rich history, to take you away from our ancestors who carried this Torah, this beating heart, this tree of life, and brought it to us. I began by sharing how my son connected to our people through our shared ancestry. And I immediately thought of a story that is very dear to me. It's a story told by Rabbi Israel Spira, who a survivor of the Shoah, the Holocaust. He told a story that one day he was a rabbi in the barrack, but he wasn't anything special compared to anyone else. They were just a number. One day they were awoken, the rabbi and his fellow prisoners, fellow Jews, starved, exhausted. They took him out to a pit. And the guards told them they all had to jump over the pit to survive. Because if they didn't, you know what would happen. And Rabbi Spira had a good friend who was completely opposite of him, not religious at all. And they argued a lot about Judaism. He was an avowed atheist. And as they stood at the complete opposite sides of our tradition, they actually became close friends. And his friend said to Rabbi Spira, he said, Spira, all of our efforts to jump over this pit are in vain. We're only entertaining these cruel guards. Let's sit down in the pit and wait for our wretched existence to end. And Rabbi Spira answered as they were walking toward the pits. He said, my friend, man must obey the will of God. If it was decreed from heaven that pits be dug and we be commanded to jump, pits will be dug and jump we must. And if God forbid we fail and fall into the pits, we will reach the world of truth a second later after our attempt. So my friend, we must jump. And the rabbi and his friend are nearing the edge of the pits, and it's rapidly filling. And the rabbi glanced down at his feet, swollen feet of a 53-year-old Jew, ridden with starvation and disease. And he looked at his young friend, who looked like a skeleton with burning eyes. And as they reached the pit, the rabbi yelled, we're jumping. And when they opened their eyes, they found themselves standing on the other side of the pit. And the friend repeated over and over while tears streamed down his eyes, Spira, we're here, we're alive. Spira, for your sake, I'm alive. Indeed, there must be a God in heaven. Tell me, Rebbe, how did you do it? And Rabbi Spira said, I was holding on to the merit of my ancestors, of our ancestors. I was holding on to the coattails of my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather of blessed memory. Spira looked at his friend and said, tell me, my friend, how did you reach the other side? And he replied, I was holding on to you. My fellow Jews and allies, I'm holding on to you. Let us join our hearts together as we did so many thousands of years ago, as we did today in this holy sanctuary, this holy space. And although it seems like the pit is widening, if we jump together, then nothing and no one can stop us. Shabbat Shalom. And